before we even start talking about Genesis, this is something we've talked about a lot, where you say, the Bible is more of a library, and all the books in the Bible are different in different ways, and the genre of the book that we're reading is really important. So before we even go further, do you think you could kind of lay context? What should we know about Genesis before having a conversation about it, especially Genesis 1 through 11, which is going to be the focus of our first talks? What do we really need to know about Genesis 1 through 11 to keep in the back of our minds before we talk any further?
Well, and I'm going to say this repeatedly throughout the discussion, I'm not an expert. I use the term highly motivated layperson. So that being said, I'm going to try and keep this as non-technical as I can, and just with the caveat that I have no formal training beyond what I've read. So I don't think, at least, I'll make clear as I go along the things that I think can be said with definitive truth, but also I want to just lay the claim that there are a lot of questions. I think the book of Genesis is mysterious in some senses, but I don't think it says very little. You made that comment there, and I just wanted to point out that the book of Genesis is a lot. You can extract a significant amount of meaning, and I think there's more that we can know than what we can't know. The question is, what are we going to agree on? So
interesting. Okay.
I don't like the appeal of mystery as a way to get out of answering tough questions, which I know you weren't saying.
Okay.
But
okay.
There is a contingency of people who do that. High level, I think the book of Genesis, what we can know about it, what we should know about it, it is the first book of the Bible for a reason. It's part of the Pentateuch, as the Septuagint would refer to it as, or the Torah, as the Hebrew Bible would refer to it as. Its title is from the Septuagint title, which is, Geneseos. I'm going to have to fact check myself on that one. But essentially the idea is Genesis is the first book of the Hebrew scriptures. And when the New Testament came around and we started to fully develop our Bible, that transitioned over. And so I think it's important because Genesis lays a few foundational principles that we really should just always have at the back of our minds when we're reading it. First and foremost is God is the sole creator. Regardless of whether or not you believe in some form of evolution, whether you believe in young earth creationism, whether you believe in old earth, young earth,
yes,
there's all sorts of views. I think the orthodox, lowercase o, orthodox Christian viewpoint has to be God created. And how he created is up for debate, I think. Why he created, I think there's a lot of nuance there. But the fact of the matter is, God was the creator. And as we read throughout the rest of the Bible, we come to realize that God created the world through Christ.
Right.
And when he created everything, he called it very good.
Yes.
And he says that over and over and over again throughout the first chapter of the Bible in Genesis. And now there's some debate about what was the nature of that goodness. Was there death before the fall? Was there the capacity to sweat before the fall?
Right.
Was there fungus and decay before the fall?
Yes.
There's debates there, sort of. That being said, regardless of how you view the nature of that goodness, God says it's good, and it was good. And I think that has tremendous value as we look at creation today in the other side of the creation account in which we live in a fallen world. Because I think there is a tendency, and I just cut me off if I go down a rabbit trail here. There's a tendency, at least in evangelical Christendom, but it's existing in other traditions too, where we sort of drift into this type of almost Gnostic outlook where we look at the world as being, lesser, right? Because, it's the spiritual realities that are more important. Things like, exactly, and I don't want to be pejorative, but the idea of escapist Christianity where we just have to hang on until we get to heaven.
Yes.
Genesis and Revelation are so closely mirrored in a number of ways. And, the idea of Genesis 1 is that God's dwelling place was with man.
Yes.
And Eden was that nexus point.
Yes.
And then we read at the end of the book of Revelation where God repeats himself. He's like, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. And then we read that later on in the other books of the Torah where, the temple is sort of this secondary nexus point in which the Garden of Eden was supposed to be. And we sort of see this chain of events where, and it all starts in Genesis where God created a good world, a good creation, and his desire was that he would dwell with mankind in a very personal, intimate way that, ultimately was severed during the fall. So I think that in of itself is important. And I think,
So I want to
Yeah.
jump in really quickly. Definitely, it's clear to me why it matters just because it's an origin, right? You can't just jump into Lord of the Rings at the Two Towers and read the second and third book, and it wouldn't really make much sense without reading the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book. So just the fact that it's an origin and a beginning, definitely very important, makes a lot of sense. But I do want to go back really quickly to the question of genre, just so we get some of the more context out of the way before we go into a lot of the interesting questions. So can you say a little bit about genre? Because you've told me, not on this podcast before, many times, that genre is really important.
Critical.
When you're reading something. So how does genre impact our reading of Genesis?
I mean, genre impacts our reading in the same way genre impacts reading in general. Like, for example, when I'm reading a book, like a textbook about any subject, I'm going to read it differently than if I read Lord of the Rings, or if I read a poem by any poet,
Right.
for example, or how I listen to a song. Like, when there's words on paper, we have to understand, sort of the broader economy of how we're going to read it.
Yes.
One of my favorite books, foundational to how I even read in general, is How to Read a Book, which I think you've read before by the, I believe, late. He must have passed away, Dr. Mortimer Adler. And he, goes through the principles of how to read. And then at the last half of the book, he actually breaks down in excruciating detail how there is a science behind reading. And whether you want to disagree or agree with it, I don't know how you would disagree with some of his principles, because at the core foundation of any good reading is, what are the rules of reading? And ultimately, the rules of reading stem around what was the intent of the author or authors. And hermeneutics, biblical interpretation, I think we have to be extremely careful with how we approach the text of Scripture, because like I said, I'm trying not to be pejorative here or say things that are beyond my area of expertise, which technically isn't really anything, but there's a phrase that I've heard thrown around quite frequently, the historical grammatical method of biblical interpretation. And the theory is, I'm going to read the book of Genesis or any book of the Bible through the historical grammatical method.
Okay.
And there's
Meaning everything is history. Basically.
well, it's probably worth, there's a few different definitions I've heard, but broadly speaking, the idea is, I'm going to read the text through the historical context in which it was written, using language as my guide. So the idea, and I don't disagree with it at all, I think it's great. The problem is when you approach it with ulterior presuppositions, that's when you start to get into trouble. I have no issue with
ulterior presuppositions to what the genre actually is.
Exactly. Like I said, the historical grammatical method is only as valuable as how it's applied within the broader context.
Okay. So here's my question. What genre do you think Genesis is, and how should we read it?
I'll say this.
Let me just say, Genesis, we're really talking 1 through 11, right? Because after that it does.
Well, it's one single, it's a single, fixed text.
But is it true that Genesis 1 through 11?
Genesis 1 through 11 has been...
Genre?
So Genesis 1 through 11 is interesting because for a long period of Christendom, it's been recognized that at least Genesis 1 and 2, but it also extends into 11. It reads differently, and its mode of, it's almost poetic in its meter, so to speak.
Okay.
And it just reads differently than the rest of the book of Genesis. Now, there's all sorts of things that could be said about that, but I would say this. I would hesitate to say that the book of Genesis is a single fixed genre of literature.
Okay.
And I don't think that in and of itself is a controversial statement, because we have to just read the text as it presents itself. Like Jesus, for example, we would consider the Gospels historical books as Christians, and we know this because of we read in the Gospel of St. Luke, where he talks about how, hey, I'm approaching this as a historian would. And that being said, though, when we get to the Gospel of John, it reads very differently than the Gospel of Luke.
Sure.
So, you have to start kind of teasing these things out on their own. But with Genesis, the first couple of chapters read differently than, let's just say, the story of Joseph.
But can you give us anything concrete? Because we were saying earlier, it's important to know genre. It's important to know what it is that we're reading. If is it a textbook or is it fiction? You gave the example because I'm going to read it differently. So what can I know so that I can go in
So
reading it in the right way?
I
Like
really
definitively and concretely, what can you actually say we know?
So, I mean, so what we know is, the statements in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what that practically means is up for debate. But I really think the foundational point of Genesis is really in that first sentence.
Well, okay,
So,
but even in
but
terms of genre, because I think the debate, as far as I understand, is this literal history or is this kind of like a mix between
oh,
history
okay. So
and
I,
like myth and
well,
poetic
I mean,
history?
there's,
Because you were saying earlier, you do think it's a combination of genres. Like what should we know exactly and concretely?
well, I think, like just let it go without saying, I would not say the book of Genesis is considered, and these terms and definitions matter here. There's a term I've heard often, like this wooden literalism, in which if I was reading wooden literalism in the book of Genesis, I would have some significant problems right in the beginning of the text. The idea that I'm reading the book of Genesis as, okay, this is how I'm reading like a textbook. Like I follow the steps and they lead to a necessary conclusion based on the idea that these things,
or history
yeah, exactly. And I don't think that's controversial in and of itself, any more controversial than the idea that the parables
Well,
were.
it would be controversial only in the sense that if you introduce the idea that some of it is not literal truth, then what do you know is and is not?
Well, that's
And it kind of lays
that's a
open the possibility of just dismissing things that you don't want to say are literal or are inconvenient, and it makes it like it would seem to make it hard to know. Yes, this is really true, and this is really a fact, and this is historical, and this is not. Like, where do we draw the lines around these things?
Yeah, I mean, to get back to the first question, there's to be. I mean, I'm still wrestling with how I would categorize the genre of Genesis.
Okay.
Truthfully, I do really like Dr. William Lane Craig's sort of broad idea of sort of mythopoetic.
Mythopoetic.
Yes, and because it's not like when we hear the word myth, we immediately think of the Greek gods,
Yes.
and we think of something that's made up. However, we often forget what myth is intended to do.
Okay.
When we because I think something that often goes unsaid but needs to be said is the book of Genesis was written within an ancient Near Eastern context.
Okay.
And when we're reading the book, we need to read it like we would read an ancient Near Eastern text.
In other words, we need to read it for the intended audience.
Yeah, so like, there's something interesting I heard, and I don't remember where I heard this, but the idea is like the Bible was written and preserved for us, but it wasn't written and preserved to us. Like we are not the direct audience, although we are the intended audience. I hope that nuance makes
I
sense.
understand what you're saying. Yeah.
So, like for example, like the creation account, for instance.
I mean, let me just say really quick, it'd be in the same way C.S. Lewis's direct audience was the British public listening to his radio talks in 1945, but his maybe larger intended audience was Christians over the centuries who would continue to engage with this.
Yeah, I mean, sort of. I mean, I think the idea is like, okay, so first of all, like I don't think we have any real way of knowing whether Moses himself actually sat down and composed every line of. I don't think he did.
Okay, because is that the sort of primary thinking is that
Moses is the traditional author, or at least
traditional, is that literally like Catholic tradition? Or
I couldn't
sort of
I couldn't say I mean I couldn't say where its origin was. I'm assuming it would be something.
Okay, so that's
Jewish,
an interesting question by itself. You don't think that Moses was just sitting down writing something?
The reason I bring that, I mean,
history or anything.
I think we're jumping all over the place here. I think getting back to what you were originally saying is the intended audience was initially Jewish people. I mean, it's from the Jewish Torah. It's composed by Jewish people, and it was composed within a particular period of history. So what that means in purely practical terms is we cannot expect whoever wrote this text to have an understanding of the world in the same that we do.
Okay.
Like, for example, they didn't know there was a Western Hemisphere. There's debates, and I think there's some settledness in this, but, there's a concept where I think the flat earth people would point to like the firmament and whatnot and say that, Jewish cosmology believed that we were on a sort of a dome-like structure. And I know there's debates about that too, which I don't know a whole lot about, so there's no point in getting into that. But the idea is, there is a reason, I think, why God chose to preserve the creation account within a particular worldview.
Okay.
And I think that matters. And I think it's faithful reading of the text to try and put ourselves in the shoes of the people who wrote it and the people who had originally read it. Now, what that's not to say is we are not eavesdropping. We're not peering our eyes into something that wasn't intended for us at all. All scriptures God breathed, useful for correcting, teaching, reproving, and training in righteousness. That was actually written by the Apostle Paul, and he was even thinking of the Old Testament. Like, so, everything in this book that we call Genesis in the broader scope of the canon of Scripture, it's for us. God preserved it for our benefit. That being said, that doesn't mean we can just take the text and do whatever it is that we want with it. Like, we can't read it like a 21st century person because it wasn't written by or for 21st century people.
Right.
Now, I can think of an immediate objection here, because if we're believing that the Bible is the inspired word of God, the idea is like, okay, well, God knew there was a Western Hemisphere. God knew scientific developments. So is he preserving error within the text for the sake of broader theological truth? Which is not what I'm saying at all. I think it's very fashionable. I don't know if it's fashionable today, but I know there was a sort of like this odd little trend in scholarship, like this neo-orthodox view where we're like, okay, or maybe neoliberalism, I'm drawing a blank on the exact term here, but where we're like, okay, the books of the Bible, they're communicating broader theological truth. We're not reading them as actual truth, though, and that in and of itself is a messy theological conundrum in of itself. I think that the book of Genesis actually means what it communicates.
Okay.
Now, what it actually means is not scientific truth. And we know that because this is they didn't have a scientific method.
Right.
They weren't even intending this to be a scientific, they weren't. And, there's this idea that the Bible is written by sort of like these pre-modern people, that they had mud huts and sticks and they didn't.
Right.
I mean, what's interesting actually.
But the only question I would have there is if the Bible is not communicating scientific truth, as you just said, but if it's God, somehow relaying the facts to Moses, or if it's an oral tradition that was preserved through the centuries, but God is obviously watching over the Bible. And if it's God's truth, then scientific truth and God's truth in some sense need to be aligned, right? Because God's historical reality isn't going to step so far outside of, God's truth is all truth, right? Does it kind of make sense what I'm saying if you say something like the Bible is not communicating scientific truth, and what is it communicating? Because if is our science wrong or is God wrong? Don't they have to be compatible in some sense, or no?
Well, that's interesting, because I don't really see any sort of tension between modern science and the book of Genesis. Because it's interesting, because we're like, okay, modern science. Well, modern science today is not the same as modern science back in the Scopes trial, when there was all the debates about evolution in schools, or even in the.
But now we are thinking of our modern science.
Yeah, and the same questions are going to exist today in 500 years.
Okay.
That may completely overturn things that we think about. Like the whole idea of Newtonian physics is even being rethought in terms of, quantum discoveries.
So can you maybe elaborate? What do you mean when you say that Genesis is not scientific truth?
Well, I would say this. So the book of Genesis is not written like a scientific textbook. And I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but it's important, because they didn't have scientific textbooks back then, and they weren't even necessarily, because the very questions that we are asking weren't, I think, really the same questions that people back in those time periods were asking. Like, they didn't have a science, like our concept of the scientific method is from Sir Francis Bacon. So
for example,
maybe
we would like take the word day as an example, where they're writing it down and they're saying he created it, the earth and everything, in 7 days. Now we have a very precise scientific meaning of day, but their understanding of day back then could have been something different. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is this, and I'm trying to be succinct and concise and very clear when I say this, but for like high level, I think you can have all sorts of different understandings of how the book of Genesis works in relation to modern science, because modern science is a moving target. It's always going to be. So like I said, in 500 years, when we have all these other scientific discoveries, it's not going to change the meaning of Genesis, because Genesis is making truth claims that are just, they're not really like scientific as much as they are, and I hate doing this, but because I think it drives an unnecessary semantics wedge, but it's making theological points on scientific points. That's not to say that it's not making true points. It's just like for example, when you read other ancient Near Eastern cosmologies, like the famous ones are the Sumerians and other Fertile Crescent cultures, they are making truth claims too. And what's fascinating about that is, the book of Genesis is already very different from those other cultures.
Okay.
And when you even read other ancient mythologies, not saying Genesis is mythologies, but when you read other ancient historical origin stories, you have, like, whether it's Egyptian, whether it's, they're later on, but, it's so easy to think about, like the Greeks or the Romans, for example,
Right.
even though they're well after the book of Genesis, it's still kind of a good illustrative point. Creation was essentially creation was sort of like this chaotic type of mess in which the gods emerged from. There was
Yes,
no,
I'm thinking
there was no,
of Norse mythology.
yeah, there was no sovereign orderliness above
Yes.
everything else. Like the gods were created beings themselves, and then from then we get this idea of they created other things, and it's messy, it's very human. We read into it, and it's messy. I mean, it really is. And you can sort of like imagine like this cauldron of chaos, as it were, and there's just
So the orderliness of Genesis stands apart
well,
from
the orderliness, I think, the orderliness, yes, but also the very idea that there is a transcendent God at all.
Okay.
Like, for example, when you read,
Even maybe the word design is important here, or intelligent mind, where there is just a sophistication, unity of intellectual force behind
well,
the
yeah.
creative process. you're
So
saying.
what's interesting to me is we read this right at the very beginning, where it says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So there's clearly something there. It's the earth.
Already something.
Yeah, but so
Okay.
yeah, and that's maybe even worth discussing at some point
Yes.
too. Like, okay, well, what was the earth, and how
Yes.
could it have been without form and void? That language would be familiar to the ancient Near Eastern people because, like, okay, yeah, like the chaos, as it
Okay.
were. However, we see that there is above the chaos another being entirely who is completely transcendent,
Right.
who is completely other, and he takes out of this chaos a sort of orderly created account
yes.
by which he creates things, and he doesn't just create things that then start devouring one another and start,
yes.
creating a further mess here.
Yes.
He goes line by line saying, it was good, it was good,
Yeah.
it was good, it was good. And then at the very end, it says, and God saw all that he created, and behold, it was very good. So it adds a further emphasis there. And so that in of itself reads very differently from the ancient Near Eastern, or even really any mythological cosmology story in of itself. And I think that matters because that immediately tells us something. That tells us that there's a God, an other God. I use the word other to emphasize the transcendent nature, who brought everything that is into existence. And there's other things that, the way theological development works is, as 2,000 years of tradition understands, like the idea of creatio ex nihilo. That's not necessarily what Genesis 1 is talking about. It's implied. Like, it's implied that at one point God did create everything out of nothing.
Yes.
But nowhere does it say that out of nothing God created.
Right.
So the reason I've been bringing that up is the point that the benefit of being 2,000 years removed from, the close of the canon is that we have a lot of understanding about what this actually meant philosophically.
Sure.
But when we jump right back into the beginning of Genesis and the culture and what was immediately written in, we have something very different here.
Okay, so that's very helpful to lay the ground in terms of context. So as we go on and as we ask many of these super fascinating and interesting questions, maybe we can try to remember as much as possible to say whether we're talking about a historical truth or a theological truth. So as we go through the questions, we can make the distinction. What a lot of the fascination stems from is the historical truth. We want to know what actually happened. What did it look like to live in the garden? What were the processes and the functions and the things that really occurred and took place? And we want to get the historical truth out of it. And then where relevant, we'll make the comment that this is a theological truth or not. So we'll just keep that as we go.
Yeah, and I'll say this much too. If we it's so tempting because obviously I'm in the same boat where I want to know how the things actually worked.
Yes.
The problem is, if you want to read the book of Genesis in that way, you're not going to get that. For the exact same reason why when we read the gospel accounts, like today, like we would be just fascinated. Like, okay, what was Jesus' favorite food?
Yes.
What was his childhood like? Like, what were do you have, friends growing up?
Hobbies.
The thing is though, ancient biography, that wasn't the type of questions that they were concerned about.
Sure.
So that's why
Yes.
they wrote the books the way that they did. They wrote it within their own particular context. If the gospels were written today, it would be probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of just all these little teeny tiny details
Maybe
about
more Thucydides style than
yeah, and I mean and I think that it's almost like I don't even want to draw the distinction between like theological and historical questions. I think they're all one and the same. It's
Okay.
just like we're writing about a real period of history here.
Yes,
Like
yes.
Genesis is the opening chapter of history or
that
recorded
is
history.
important just to say that.
Yeah,
We're not talking about strict.
Just-
You made the point that there
Yeah,
is historical.
just because we're talking about something that doesn't read like the type of history that we're used to doesn't mean it's not historical.
For example, I heard Alex O'Connor say something, or maybe it was Richard Dawkins. I think was listening to a discussion between them where nowadays most sort of intelligent theists or Christian philosophers sort of look at Genesis 1 through 11 as complete myth. There was no actual real historical Adam because that is sort of puts them on better modern scientific ground. And you would disagree with that.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
would.
want to talk too long about that because we have a lot of questions to get to, but maybe you want to say something about
I mean, yeah, like I guess I would say the problem with that whole mentality is, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, is at the end of the day, I have like when I die, I want this phrase on my gravestone, define your terms, because when we use the word myth,
Yeah.
like the whole idea is we're not talking about like
Something that was made up.
yeah, something that was made like we think, and this is sort of like kind of this idea of like I think Tolkien and Lewis, but really Tolkien, he sort of Christianized the idea of what myth actually is. Like, okay, not the Chronicles of Narnia, the Lord of the Rings, any rational person is going to read that and know that it didn't actually happen.
Okay.
And we know that because Tolkien, we know, made these stories up.
Right.
But his intent wasn't to communicate, okay, like the history, as involved as he was in the accounts that he wrote, he was making the whole point that I want my stories to point to something that actually did happen.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that when I read Genesis, okay, I'm reading something that was inspired by God. I'm reading something that actually happened.
Okay.
And I'm reading about events, like actual things that happened.
Okay.
What I'm not reading about is how they happen. That's a very separate question. And I think what matters is that we take these words like myth and story and we just sort of, there's so much baggage tied to what those words actually mean that it's like, I even hesitate to use the word myth in general just because, people hear myth and their brains,
Yes, no.
you have to do all of this backtracking
This
just
is
to get
making
to the
sense.
point of,
It's written in a particular way at a particular time for a particular audience to understand a truth
Yes.
that did happen. But
Yes.
the way that they communicated then isn't the literal biographical, historical, footnoted way that we
and
write now.
what we have today, and that's why like Genesis is even relevant today, is because, like for example, right now the trend amongst physicists and cosmologists is trying to find a way to look at the universe as something that never actually began. It was, and that's a whole separate discussion, and people with degrees can talk about that. But the trend right now is that we are looking at the universe broader than just our world as something that always existed. So in that sense, the Bible does make a significant contradiction to that, and that there was an origin point to everything.
Yes.
And
In the beginning,
in the
right?
in the
The
in
very
the
word
beginning,
beginning.
yes, in the beginning. And so, if people are afraid that
Or
we're
at least went by the but went really quickly when you say there was an origin point to everything. By everything, you are talking about the physical universe.
the physical universe, yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I think this has been super great context and laying the foundation because, again, we're going to be talking about Genesis 1 through 11 for maybe 15 to 20 weeks here. So,
Oh, boy. Okay.
A lot to talk about. Okay. So, I just want to go right into some of the questions, and those questions will provoke other questions. And I mean, there's just so much to talk about. So, here's a question for you. This is going to go right to Adam and Eve. So, Adam and Eve, obviously, we know they sinned. They took and ate the apple. But a question that has long lived in my mind is, how long were Adam and Eve in the garden before they sinned? Did they have children? I mean, was it right away? And they were given this command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Did they do that? I mean, were they living out the command? They were walking with God. It would seem like they were given this divine command. They would have been fruitful. Why would they wait so long? Maybe that implies that they fell within days or hours if they didn't have any children, or maybe they did have children and we have no idea. But really, this question of how long were they in the garden before they before they fell?
Well, I mean, lest this go without saying, we have no way of knowing.
No way.
We have no way of knowing. I mean, on almost like I don't want to be that guy.
But when you say there's no way of knowing, are there
now-
even clues,
so
ideas? Can you give an answer based on surmises or
Well,
indications of the text or
so
references of?
I guess in my mind,
anything.
I guess in my mind, like I said, it's
Here's
almost.
how I'll have to phrase many of these questions. Gun to your sister's head, you have to give your best guess answer. Are you able to formulate anything?
I would guess not very long.
Okay.
But I also want to make the point that this is very similar to the ideas like, did Adam have a belly button? Like we could go back and forth all day long. But
you said guess, so
the reason why I guess is
guess.
it's a very human answer to this question.
Okay,
Like it's borderline carnal. I just have a hard time believing that Adam and Eve, but we also have to like it theoretically could have happened, but also at the end of the day, Adam and Eve were given a command: be fruitful and multiply.
Yes.
It seems to, when you read the Bible and you get to here Genesis 4, where Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. It seems that was the first instance in which they had children. There would be, I think. I have no like. There's really I would question whether or not they had children beforehand.
Okay.
And the only reason I would say that is because when we see the curse in the fall, God tells Eve, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing, and pain you shall bring forth children. That being said, the question that pops in my mind is like, well, did she know what that was even like?
I was going to say, if her pain is being multiplied,
So-
doesn't that almost imply a reference point? Like she had a reference for what the experience of childbirth was like if she could comprehend that it would be multiplied.
And I guess in my mind, I almost wonder if, like I said, this is where it almost gets carnal here. It seems to me like God created Adam and Eve, and Adam beheld Eve, and regardless of how you want to look at the creation account of mankind, the whole idea is like there was a historical couple, Adam and Eve, two physical beings, and it's just like I almost imagine like, okay, the two shall become one flesh. For lack of a better term, it seems like it's almost their wedding that's recorded. And, like, I just have a hard time believing that Adam and Eve weren't figuring out how to practically be fruitful and multiply, which makes me think, did they just not conceive children for that length of time? There's no way of really knowing.
It was sort of either need to be a short length of time, or else they had children who maybe were just taken up to heaven mad.
Well, that's where we have to be like, there's just no way of knowing. Now, that being said, this is an interesting thing to think about because I don't know how this would even be done, but there is an interesting idea about like this idea of like for a short story where Adam and Eve, as they're being expelled from the garden, maybe they watch the children that they had before, like there's a separation. But that being said, like we got to be clear here.
That
like,
would be a fascinating story.
But I mean, I almost wonder if it should be written because the problem is that sort of thing is that's how we get into sort of this idea where we're starting to put unhealthy. Like I'm all about questions and whatnot, but like an unhealthy level of speculation towards things that we just have no way of knowing.
John Milton comes from, right?
No, not disdain at all. But I think it makes a good point because like the idea of like with Paradise Lost, a fictional work, a profound fictional work, a work I have deep respect for, I think has added an unhealthy level of influence on how we view angels, how we view hell, how we view Satan.
Yes.
And I think it would be unfair to say John Milton had any intention to do that anyway. The point is because
the ideas are so influential, we lose track of where they came from. And
and I mean, at the end of the day, like, so that's why I even said, like, to the point it may make, like, we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but there's no way of knowing. That being said, gun to my head, I don't think they were in there for very long, just because, I mean, the text seems like it moves fairly quickly, but also I just have a hard time believing. It seems like Adam and Eve.
Here's another question. Here's a question that we can bring to bear on this as well. So, in Paralandra by C.S. Lewis, you have this idea of also another Adam and Eve on a created planet, and they end up not sinning. And in the process of not sinning, they actually validate their will by not sinning, and they come to the knowledge of good and evil. But because they didn't sin, they retained their sin nature. I wonder if the fact that they fell when they did almost betrays a naivete that they had, whereas maybe Satan or whoever the Satan figure is felt this need to sort of come down as quickly as possible before they could get to that point of coming to the knowledge of a good and evil in a Paralandrian way, sort of on their own. Like if they reject, or maybe this is then another thought that pops into my head is, Christ sort of validates his free will in a sense in the temptations in the desert when he is tempted and he rejects. And if he's the second Adam, he is offered sort of an apple in a way, and he rejects it, and he therefore retains his immortal, infinite nature without falling and coming back to it, or without coming to that knowledge through sin as Adam did. So I just wonder if there's a way. I wonder if Adam and Eve needed to be tempted, like that had to happen because the question of free will had to be decided one way or another. So Satan came to them inevitably, or he came to them really quickly because he needed to. But ultimately, it's sort of this question. I wonder if it signifies anything about the length of time in the garden. And then, of course, there is that question of, did the temptation have to happen for the sake of free will? It's kind of two questions.
The thing that's interesting is there's a lot that could be said there, I guess. But the one thing that I think about just right off the rip, for lack of a better term, is, well, also parenthetical statement here, the fact that you keep referring it to as an apple, like that was the fruit, just sort of points out the influence of how like non-biblical Christian art is influenced. But
because
who knows what it was?
Who knows what the fruit was?
But at the same time, I think what's interesting is God, there's two trees that God creates. There's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But there's also, and this is something too where we see like kind of paralleled in the book of Revelation, where there's sort of like this tree of life. And when we see in the, and I'm actually turning to it right now so I can read it exactly, in the fall, and verse 3:24, God drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed a cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So they were allowed to eat of the tree of life. And there's an interesting idea that mankind was not made intrinsically mortal. That's something that you and I have often discussed. Mm-hmm. Mortality was a gift to humankind to participate in the divine life of God. But also at the end of the day, we have to realize, like, okay, so they were allowed to eat this tree, but not this tree. Why were they not allowed to eat of this tree?
It's hard to know whether I should stop there or just let you keep going, because I just want to make the comment that is a design choice, right? God didn't have to make man not mortal and then sustain them with the tree. He could have just made them mortal. So this tree needs to be created.
I'll say, well, what's interesting too is you read about the book of Revelation, where it talks about like the tree of life, alongside the river that leads into the New Jerusalem, and you can take without payment, is what the scripture says. Sure. And there's more than one of these trees. Yes. So in that sense, it's like, it's almost, expanding upon the original idea that eternal life is a gift given to mankind by God.
Maybe it's a design choice for symbolic purposes to always remind us of the fact that, in a sense, God created us and he could have made us anyway, but he chose to make us immortal, and that choice is his gift.
Well, I mean, so the idea of like soulish immortality being innate to the ontology of humankind, like that understanding of anthropology is very Greek in its origin, the idea of the immortality of the soul. Okay. So I think there's like, this is sort of getting into the weeds here, but I don't think we as Christians are expected, lowercase o, Orthodox Christians, to view the soul, whether it's intrinsically immortal or not. I don't think that really matters. That being said, our mortality is in union with God was contingent upon our participation in the divine life, which was given to us through obedience. And what's interesting is either way you look at it, because Dr. Michael Heiser, who passed away a number of years ago, he was actually the one who really introduced me to this idea of God's divine family. The idea that Eden was sort of like this meeting point between the divine world and the mortal world, for lack of better terms, and all of the sons of God, the Bene Elohim or Elohim, which is how they're referred to. lowercase e Elohim. Now, there's a whole separate discussion in of itself there. But then there's also the idea where, because God seems like he created them in their image. And the reason why I would say that, and this is controversial in of itself, where God is saying so, let me pull to the verse itself. This is where God is creating mankind, and he says, "Let us create man in our image after our likeness." The plurality.
You said God was the sole creator, but it does say, "Let us make man in our."
So
let us make man in our.
So this is controversial, but I think Dr. Michael Heiser makes some very, very interesting points where he talks about how who's God speaking to when he says our image, our likeness.
Is it the Trinity?
Some people would look at it as sort of like a self-referential Trinitarian. I'm not certain of the Hebrew grammar in regards to it, but if Dr. Michael Heiser, who is an ancient Semitic scholar, believes that he's referencing a corporate group outside of himself, I'm inclined to think that it's an open question. Yeah. Well, first of all, angel, comes from the Greek angelos, so messenger. So when we refer to the word angel, I think the best term we need to use is the Hebrew term Elohim, lowercase e, which is because angel's a job title. It's not to say like, okay, you're a messenger, that you can be a
angel. But Elohim means God, right?
Well, it's often translated as God, but in the lowercase g, God.
So basically, you would maybe say that an angel is a spiritual figure of high authority and power. Like,
I would just define it quite simply as a non-corporeal finite being, but created by God.
For the sake of discussing something in an accessible way, couldn't we just use the word angel?
Yeah.
Because it is referring to this. There aren't different categories of spiritual being that God created before humankind. So there are just there's human and angel, or Elohim, angel / Elohim, and there's nothing else, right? Is that not true? In terms of eternally created beings.
Yeah, eternally created beings.
Sorry. Beings within eternal destiny, let's say. Spiritual consciousness. I'm ruling out animals when I say that.
Yeah, I guess I would say, getting back to the whole concept of what Dr. Michael Heiser introduced me to, this idea like God's family. Like he had the angels. Okay. We'll use that term. That's simple. But he created the angels, and they, in a sense, also bore his image and likeness. If that's how we read, it'll be, Genesis in that particular, or even if you don't read it in that particular way.
I think when you say image and likeness, that's the idea of God sort of having the nature of God, right?
Well,
and the nature of God in that sense would be the quality of a mind or a soul or an eternal destiny or something like that.
It can. The whole idea, I think. So this is what's interesting. So I think the default presupposition that most Christians have when they hear the term image of God is they look at it very ontologically, like the substance of one's being, which I don't think is wrong at all. I'm not arguing against that. However, it does make me wonder if it's almost sort of a, like God created everything, right? Yes. And what we mean by everything and how he created is a separate issue. But what's interesting is God creates the world. It talks about how he creates plants and animals and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is then we get to Genesis 2:5, where it says, "No bush of the field is yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land." Okay, God's the one who's, kind of getting creation kickstarted. But then he says in that same verse, "And there is no man to work the ground." So mankind is participating in God's creation. So I almost wonder if the image of God, it's not saying this is, what is fully intended by God, created man in his own image after his own likeness. I almost wonder if it also has something to do with the fact that we are God's representatives here on earth. God wants us to be participants in creation. That's why I hold a very high view of nature. Like I don't love the idea of people just exploiting natural resources for the sake of gains. Yeah. And what's interesting too is I'm almost wrapping up with the Silmarillion, and the first part of the Silmarillion where, Tolkien is talking about creation, he gets very explicit with his little mythology that he writes, in which the created beings that the heir of Iluvatar, he makes them actually the ones that do all of the sub-creating for him.
Yes, that is so
he
interesting.
alone is the one that gives life to the elves and mankind.
Yes.
So that in of itself, I think, is just such a fascinating, like, who knows? I think so in that sense, the breath of life is
so Eru Ilúvatar, similarly as the God figure for the Middle Earth, Lord of the Rings universe. Eru Ilúvatar sort of breathes life in the same way that God breathes life. Well,
Yeah, like God is
reverse it. God breathes life into Adam, and then Tolkien's playing off that, saying Eru Ilúvatar puts the breath of life, so to speak, into elves and men, but then he leaves sort of the rest of creation to his angelic figures.
and in the same way that God
And you're wondering if there's a similar, well, again, whatever Tolkien came up would be a reflection of the truth of God, or maybe a reflection or not. But you're saying, when got back to what we were saying earlier, when God says, let us make man in our own image, you're wondering if it's sort of like God is directing a orchestra and they're all working together to sort of create this. And is that what you're saying?
Well, I want to be very clear here. Whether this happened or didn't happen, I think is to what extent the other created beings, the angels that we're referring to, participated in creation. That's an open-ended discussion.
Okay.
That being said, in whatever way they participated in creation,
Yes.
it has to be stated with utmost clarity that it is God who sustains creation.
Okay.
And I think it's important to say that, because at the end of the day, if God is the uncaused first cause.
So what you're saying is without God being there, none of it works.
Oh, of course
That's
not.
important to say.
I mean, that's, I think, one of the main messages of Genesis.
I want to ask a quick question here while we're in this topic. And I'm assuming right now that angels existed before God said in the beginning.
So what's
Right? Genesis 1:1.
Yes.
Now, I'm questioning that assumption right now. Do I assume that just simply because of it? Is this like a Miltonian thing? Is there a biblical basis for this?
So-
where does that assumption that I have come from? And can you answer that question? When were the angels created?
I can't necessarily answer,
Or at least could you say before or after?
I would say before, and the
Before God creates
earliest mention I can think of is actually, I'm reading through St. Augustine's City of God, and he makes the interesting point, and St. Augustine, if you want to talk about, someone who is not a young earth creationist, St. Augustine, he actually had and this is where I'm getting into things I'm not an expert about, but from when I read Augustine's views of creation and Genesis, he has an enormously allegorical view of Genesis, well and far beyond what even I would be comfortable admitting.
Okay.
But he seems to put the creation of angels actually in verse 1-3.
Really?
Let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there's even angel on the first day.
Fascinating.
And I haven't done too much of a study into this particular facet of Augustinian theology, but it's interesting, and if I understand what he's saying correctly, is whether he asserts or wonders out loud, I think is,
Okay.
that's a question for the Augustinian scholars, but it seems to indicate like this is almost perhaps where the fall of angels happened, where we read in,
Sure.
this Lucifer's cast from heaven.
Yes.
Because what's interesting is, and this would fall in line with St. Augustine's fondness for allegory, separates the light from the darkness, because we don't see the sun or the moon created until following subsequent days of creation. So it's like, okay, and there's a lot of very strong connections between the angels and stars, like the Christian understanding of stars. Dr. Gavin Ortland actually he had a lovely podcast that I just absolutely love listening to, where he sort of talks about a Christian view of the stars and how there's a very strong correlation between stars and angelic beings that you see all throughout Christian and church history. And so all that to be said, I'm not saying that's when angels were created. Just I think Augustine may have been the first to speculate when in the timeline angels were created. However,
even this reference of a rebellion in heaven, Lucifer comes to Adam and Eve, it does seem like at a minimum they were created before men were created.
I would say so. And
it
talks about, Jesus even says that he saw Satan fall like a star or lightning from heaven.
Right.
And so, and then we read about, in Ezekiel, where it references the prince of Tyre, and there's a whole separate question about who he's referencing there. But the interesting thing is, like, there was, and this is another discussion point, the Satan figure. Satan, we'll use his proper noun, even though Satan is not a proper noun in Hebrew.
But
so Satan he clearly has some involvement prior to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden because he's saying things that are outside of what is immediately presented to us in the scripture. So God told Adam and Eve in the day that you eat of this tree, so on and so forth.
Yes.
But so somehow Satan also has that information too. Whether he was hiding in the bushes, listening in, like we don't know.
Yes.
But the point is, his creation account was clearly separate from the creation of Adam and Eve, and so it seems to make sense, especially if we take the consideration that God is referencing a corporate group,
Yes.
our image, our likeness. Then they would have perhaps been there before. So
It's interesting to wonder, by the way, whether the angels were created before, and if that fall from grace that Lucifer or Satan and his demon followers experience, was that before the creation? Because it's interesting to think, and I'm thinking this right now, of this whole host of fully conscious spiritual beings that are in opposition to God existing as God's creating a new world. Right? Versus if it's as Augustine is saying, and it's on day 2 or 3, they're a part of this creation process versus, where the angels, like, watching from outside the territory they were allowed to enter into. I mean, in Milton, of course, the angels are already in hell. They're having this conference and they're sort of finding out that God has created a new world. And then they sort of like, it's like, oh, they get their purpose. Okay, now we know what to do. Let's go destroy that world. Versus if they're created 3 days in and then they rebel. It's interesting to sort of think about, were they watching God make this new world as already fallen creatures, or were they like a part of this process, and maybe Satan is sort of one bad angel in the creative process who goes in? And it is really different. It really is a very different historical. It would just be a very different historical reality, one way or the other.
yeah, and I think that's another, like, it really, right at the very beginning, you said, what do we have to take away from Genesis? And I think
Yes.
that's a good second point among many points, and it's just not one point in any particular order. God created the world to be good. And so regardless of how you view creation or whatnot, like, God created and created to be good.
Okay.
And I think one of the most powerful messages of the gospel is that when Christ says, behold, I am making all things new.
Yeah.
The old earth shall pass away, and a new heavens and a new earth shall replace it. In one sense, it's not returning things back to Eden, because Eden was a place of innocence, but rather God is remaking the world to fit that which he originally designed, so that the world is a fit habitation for God to have a dwelling place with mankind. A holy, righteous God is not going to dwell amongst sin. And so that's, I think, the whole idea of Eden is, which, there's debates about, was Eden a physical place? Was it a garden? I mean, Ezekiel seems to make it out to be a mountain. So what's interesting is that I almost wonder if God's original charge to humankind was be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, which we see. And it seems to me that his original idea was like, look, go and make the rest of the world like Eden. Because Eden was a single geographical point. That's something that we read about. Like, the whole world wasn't Eden. Okay. We don't know it was outside the world. So, I think of, like, this paradise, which was a focal point. And the question, I think...
Even subdue has a kind of conquering language in it.
And what's interesting is I don't take this particular point myself. This is where we get into the real controversy here, where there's, like, I know Dr. Josh Swamidas makes this point, and I don't know if he was asserting or just thinking out loud here, that what if there was other quote unquote people outside of the garden, and what if the rest of the world was actually fallen before Adam and Eve were created, and Adam and Eve's task was to go out and subdue the rest of the world and make it like Eden, and when Adam and Eve fell, the world just sort of fell into complete chaos and destruction. I wouldn't go that far. I think that leads to some very uncomfortable questions.
That opens up a lot.
But there are questions, I think, that are worth asking in some regards. But I think the simplest way, and I'm a fan of informed but simple reading. I heard someone say, like, I think the simplest way to read the text is just God created the world in 6 24-hour days.
Right.
I respect the idea that I want to read the text without coming in with presuppositions.
Yes.
However, if we read the text like that, we end up with more questions.
Yeah.
And so I guess all the things
Right.
I'm trying to get back to is I want to be an informed reader.
It's like we don't want to twist our own.
Yeah, I don't want to
text.
stretch the text beyond what it
Yes.
seems to be indicating.
Right. But actually, of course, the goal at the end of the day has to be truth.
Yes, and regardless of how we put together all of the questions that we have, whether the Earth is a 13.6, well, universe is 13.6 billion years ago, whether we put the Earth as being 10,000 years old,
Yes.
100,000 years, however old we want to put
Before
it,
getting into that.
it doesn't matter. I think what we have to say as Christians is God's original creation in its original form was good.
Yes.
It was good.
Right. Of course.
He wouldn't have said it as many times as he did if he didn't intend it to be good.
interesting.
So that was the original telos of creation.
Okay.
Goodness made manifest in a
But-
created order.
Really quickly, back to this question of from earlier of did Adam and Eve have to be tempted? Because also Christ was tempted. You said earlier, or maybe a few minutes ago, that God can't coexist with sin and fallenness. So my question here is, why would a fallen spiritual being be allowed into Eden? Was it, God would come down, which, by the way, we could talk about that by itself. God would come down and walk with Adam and Eve, which is interesting because that seems to imply he would come down and then leave and go back. But he would come down and he would walk with Adam and Eve. So obviously, assuming here that, this fallen spiritual being, Satan, let's say, comes in when God's obviously not walking with Adam and Eve. So is God's presence removed from the garden? But of course, God would know what's happening. But really, I'm getting to this question of, why would a fallen spiritual being be allowed into Eden? Was Satan sneaking in? Was this Job-like, where he goes up to God into the heavenly courtroom and he asks for permission to go and tempt Adam and Eve? Does he sneak in? Ultimately, he gets in and he has this conversation and it results in the fall of the world. Did Adam and Eve need to be tempted in order to either validate free will in the positive, where they sort of prove their obedience to God, or not? And I would like to get into this question of, was the fall inevitable? But let's just start with why Satan got to the point of being able to just talk to Eve in the first place.
Well, I'll say this, and I think this is where we need to be clear in what we're saying. The idea that God cannot dwell amongst sin is not to say that it's metaphysically or ontologically impossible.
Okay.
God's not it's not like sin and God are magnets, and
one-
you start pushing one the other, and he's immediately repelled. Because in one very real sense, God condescends himself to manifest himself.
But he had to condescend.
Well, that I think gets into...
By the way, let's just finish that so we're clear. We're saying he condescended to come down as a man, take the form of a man and experience human limitations. And so in that sense, God could interact with the world in sin, but he did have to lose something of the infinite God, Father nature. Right?
Well, man, there's a lot we got to be saying. We got to be careful on what we say and how we say it. But I'll say this much. God, however he existed prior to creation, he was wholly other. And I think that's something that sometimes we forget.
Wholly other.
Is that, for example, when God introduces himself to Moses in the burning bush, he's like, who are you? And he says, I am. He is an eternally present, wholly transcended being that requires nothing to support his existence, because he, his divine aseity, the doctrine of his self-existence, God requires no life support. And that's the part of God where, and this is where some of my studies of the Eastern Church has really given me good insight into this, is the idea that God, and this is where we could get into the whole question of, divine simplicity versus the divine essence energies debate. That's a fun thing to talk about, but I think it's relevant here in the sense of, God proper, which is interesting. And this is side note, this is going to kind of hopefully illustrate my point. I don't think when we get to heaven, we are ever going to be able to physically behold God the Father. Because we have God the Son. We experience God the Father through God. And I hope I didn't commit some Trinitarian heresy on accident there. No. But the whole idea is there are three persons within the Trinitarian Godhead, and they exist wholly other of creation. That is to say that there was never a period of quote unquote, like it's even, I think it's even meaningless to say that there was never a time where God was not, because God is separate from time.
Yes.
And so what's interesting is,
yeah, that's a meaningless statement.
in a well, in a sense, it's like kind of like the
Time
whole,
and God not
it's
having
like,
a
well,
relation.
God created a rock so big you can't lift it. Well, that's a meaningless statement in of itself, because, like there's all ideas like, well,
These are such tempting rabbit holes, because I want to ask about,
well, what was your original question? I can't even remember what
the
you were.
linearness of God's thought would seem to imply linear time even
Well,
before God
I guess to
created time.
kind of wrap everything up to what you were originally
Okay,
asking,
okay.
God desired to dwell with his creatures.
Okay.
That is very clear from Genesis. And God's desire to dwell with his creatures is very interesting, because when Satan and the angels were kicked
Yeah.
out of heaven, they didn't want to dwell with God.
Right.
So they're kicked out. And Adam and Eve,
Interesting.
regardless of their, intentions,
yeah.
which may or may not have been good.
Their intentions were that they decided that their current status wasn't good enough, and they wanted to be like God, right? I mean, that was their intention.
Well, it's interesting because Adam and Eve, like,
They weren't content with what God gave them.
and what's also interesting too is I also suspect that, the knowledge of the good and evil, they unfortunately had to experience experientially. That knowledge came a posteriori.
Yes.
So what's interesting about that regard is they were willing to let someone else other than God be their teacher.
Yes.
And they were content with a lesser form of wisdom that was, because I wonder if God would have supplied them with some, like,
That's what I'm saying. Paralandra is the
yeah,
idea
I mean,
of
like,
replacing
innocence,
knowledge of good and evil
like,
with
I
knowledge
don't
of sin.
suspect innocence would have remained the default sort of position
No,
of
certainly not. I
humankind.
think
They would have
that's why-
grown in
I just
wisdom.
think that's why Paralandra is such an interesting.
But what's also interesting, I think, is that, man, like I said, my brain goes in like 1,000 different directions here, so it's even hard to figure out where to even start. But I maybe
Well-
just stay to your point.
Yeah.
When God walked amongst the garden, I think Adam and
Okay,
Eve were
yes.
truly experiencing God.
Okay.
I think they were truly, whether that was, a pre-incarnate Christ,
yes.
that's a separate.
Yes.
They were truly experiencing God. They weren't,
Right.
there's no, curtain in between
Yes, yes.
God and man at that time.
That is, I mean,
So-
that is just, by the way, fascinating, because again, the knowledge, I mean, after the fall, they're comparing their experience with what they had before, and they would be the only ones other than Christ, the only human other than Christ, to really know what that experience is completely, fully experientially, like in a restored, perfected, well, in their case, it wasn't restored, it was designed, and then designed, perfected, and non-fallen state. But I want to jump to that original question, which took us to God walking with Adam and Eve, which is Satan getting access to them. I mean, I remember the scene in Paradise Lost where I think Satan is actually like hiding in the wall of the garden. He's like waiting for an opportunity to jump over. I might have that slightly wrong, but I think there's I actually think, if I remember, you may have read it more recently, there's like an angel that's sort of guarding it, and he's like waiting for an opportunity. But I remember he's sort of like in the wall somewhere, and he's like waiting to jump over and kind of sneak up to Eve. How do you think Satan was given access? Was that because it was necessary? Did he sneak in? Obviously, God permitted this. Like, what can we sort of say? What are the historically factual things we can say, and then like what are guesses that we can make? Reasonably educated guesses. What would you just say about this whole subject of Satan getting access to Adam and Eve to the point of having a one-on-one conversation with Eve?
I mean, if you're asking whether he came through a bush or a door, I have no idea. And I don't think we really have any way of knowing, honestly. That being said, I will say, and this is probably going more along the question you asked, which I found the most intriguing, was the fall inevitable? I guess, so, I mean, it's not a sin to be tempted,
Okay.
first of all. And if that were true, then
Yes.
the very fact that Christ was tempted in the wilderness was, I mean, that wasn't, it's not sin to be
Right,
tempted. However,
Well, can I just really quickly, we can say for sure, obviously, right? God allowed this interaction to happen.
Yes.
He knew about it. Right?
Yes.
He knew about it.
yes.
Okay, so Satan comes in, he's allowed to come in, and God knows about this. Satan comes up to Eve. Now, the way that the conversation is happening, Eve and Adam do you think they know God is fully aware of this conversation or not? Because they hide from God.
Yes.
So
I think-
which is kind of crazy because they think they can hide from God. Do they, this is taking me down a rabbit trail again. Does that mean Adam and Eve don't fully understand God's nature if they think they can hide from him? I mean, if they're sort of like having this secret conversation on the side and they don't obviously know that God knows that
Well,
it's
Adam and Eve, I think, well,
like they're not expecting to be struck with lightning for sinning. I mean, or they're just completely believing what Satan says. Like, do they not have a correct? I mean, it's just interesting because on the one hand, it appears that they don't have an accurate or complete understanding of God's nature, and on the other hand, that's the thing they're being tempted is you can be like God. They want to be like God, but they don't actually fully understand if they think they can hide from God.
well,
What would
I
you say
will. I
about
mean,
that?
on one hand, I think a lack of theological correctness is not necessarily the root of sin. I think Adam and Eve were still in a state of innocence. Like you think about,
Innocence
like when
meaning
I was a kid, if I did something wrong, my default position was to hide. So like, oh, if I hide on my bed, no one's ever gonna find me.
Okay.
So maybe it's in that sense. Like I don't think Adam
But
and Eve.
innocence in that case is like lack of wisdom and maturity, is what you're saying.
Right, but also like it's hard to say. I think what was going through Adam and Eve's mind, but I think it was a very natural response because when God was walking through the garden saying, "Where are you?" He knew where they were.
Of
like
course,
I
of
think
course.
it's
But
God-
they thought, but it
yeah.
seems that they thought
So
God didn't know where.
yeah, and I think the whole point of what that call was God instilling in Adam and Eve, like now there's a separation. You feel the need to hide from me now.
Yes, yes.
And
Interesting.
I mean, Adam and Eve, now what that innocence looked like, I don't know what can be said or couldn't be said, but at the very least, did Adam and Eve have a fully fleshed out view of it? I don't know. I mean,
They must not have.
well, I don't
And
think.
surely they must not have. If they thought they were at this secret one-on-one conversation with the
Okay, but
devil.
we still sin, and we have perhaps more theological facts than Adam and Eve did. So it's
we
not
also
so
have
that.
sin nature, right? And
I mean, Adam and Eve were able to sin without a sin nature. There's a
they were
separate.
able,
There's a
but
separate
we
debate
sinned
too.
because of our sin nature, and they didn't because of their sin nature.
Well, I would argue that the reason we sin is not necessarily intrinsically tied to the fact that we have a sin nature, but that's a whole separate debate in
okay,
itself.
separate conversation.
But the whole idea is like Adam and Eve were able to sin without a sin nature. So clearly having a sin nature is not necessary for a sin.
Definitely.
Sin
You know,
is
by the way, let me just say real quickly, this is one of my favorite things about the Adam and Eve story. Neither is an intimate knowledge of God, right? Where like I think of the Grand Inquisitor section of Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, where the Grand Inquisitor is saying, if you had just jumped and everybody saw it, they would have believed, and they would have followed you unquestionably. And some people say, if God would just appear, if he did this little miracle, if he would prove himself, if there were more rational proofs, whatever, then I could believe. But Adam and Eve literally walked with God every single day. They saw it, they knew him in some clear sense. They conversed in a out loud spoken way, and yet they still sinned.
well, I think of like if what's
So
interesting
apparently
about
all those things.
Christ walked
are
on
not-
earth
were
and did
not
all of these
necessarily
miracles.
sufficient.
People physically, like
Yes,
this idea is like
that's true.
if
Yeah.
Jesus, came out of the sky,
Yeah.
and showed himself to me, I would believe. But then we read in the Gospels when Jesus, literally resurrected from the dead, and people said they still doubted. So clearly, and that's I think an important point. In our modern age, like we're not as modern as we think we are. First of all,
Okay.
we still have the same questions, fears, and hopes that people thousands of years ago did. But we are tempted to think, I must have empirical evidence
Yeah.
before I do something. And, the idea that, okay, the book of Genesis must line up to empirical evidence before I believe it's true. With Adam and Eve, like they weren't even thinking in those terms. All they thought was like, oh, I did something that I knew I wasn't supposed to do. And what's interesting is like the presence of shame began seemingly instantaneously when they ate of the fruit.
Yes,
They
yes.
realized they were naked.
Yes.
They're like, oh, crap. And they may have heard God coming and they felt the need to hide from God because all of a sudden they felt naked in it. Like that in of itself is a fascinating.
But yeah, that is real. Okay,
So-
two questions there. Number one, did they sin and immediately God's like flying down to the garden to walk with them? Like, is it immediate? They apparently have enough time to like sew fig leaves, so it's not right away. So they make clothes for themselves before God, or no, sorry. Well, I guess God made better clothes, so they sewed fig leaves. So they had enough time to like cut or procure the fig leaves, sew them together, make clothes for themselves, go find a place to hide. I wonder if it almost seems to me like God would come walk with them at like, I don't know, certain times. And it's like, okay, God, we know God comes every Saturday at 7 p.m. or something like that.
Well,
and it's like we have to, and so God meets them at a certain place or he walks in a certain way and they're not there. So God is looking for them and they're hiding. And so that's also very interesting to me to think that they would have had time in the garden between. There is time between when they fall and when God comes and has this conversation.
Well,
They
what's
do
interesting
actions in the meanwhile.
is so I've heard this question people have asked before, like the idea of, was Adam with Eve when she was tempted?
Yes.
So which it seems to indicate he was.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh man, where did Adam, where was Adam when Eve was being tempted? He should have protected her. It seems very obvious that he was right there.
Standing right there.
But what's interesting to me
Because
is
she
like,
turns and hands the
yes. But what's interesting to me is why were Adam and Eve not with God? Right. So clearly, so
because he would come and walk with them. Doesn't that implies it's not a constant togetherness, right? He would come and
I
walk.
wonder, and this is me speculating, I wonder if God's presence with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is similar in the sense of God's presence in our lives today, where God is as immediately available as the people who desire Him to be.
Fascinating.
So why were Adam and Eve not with God? Like why were they not with God? Now,
What does with mean? Like with, I was saying, like literally, we're talking about the pre-incarnate Christ.
Well, what's interesting
walking in the
is-
garden the same way he came to Abraham, like Abraham reach out and touch him in some physical sense.
I mean,
or are we saying with in the sense of like his spirit? is
I would
with us?
I would resist the temptation to, pun intended, to get too speculative in what that would have looked like.
Okay.
Because on one hand, we have to be careful that God is, I'm inclined to think that God, at least in some sense, was in an embodied form, but he wasn't human in the sense that Christ was. But nevertheless, I almost wonder if, and this is me thinking out loud here, trying not to commit a heresy. I almost wonder if, because like you think about it today, where God is as present in our God's, like we say theologically that God is omnipresent, like God's everywhere. So God's spatial. God is not just his knowledge is not just about things that have happened, will happen, might happen, can happen, do that. Like he's also like aware of all things at all times
Yes.
within our scope of understanding. So God was very aware of what Adam and Eve were doing. Like
Right,
like
of course.
we can't just be like, oh, God was caught off surprise.
Right.
So I would resist, and this is a real view, by the way, that there's a sort of open theism in which God is actually not aware, whether by choice or by nature, of what mankind is going to do. Like open
Yes.
theism is a very real view.
I was actually first presented with open theism as a way of escaping the question of theodicy, the problem of pain.
Well, I think the beautiful part about Christ is that God is strong enough to withstand those criticisms without having to retract from
Yes.
who he is.
Yes, yes.
So that I think is important to recognize, is that God is imminently aware of everything that is happening.
Yes.
And so,
But would you agree that Adam and Eve had some limited knowledge of God's true nature?
Well,
If they thought they could hide.
I'll
If they
say,
thought there was even utility in sowing, like, was it like, okay, we're naked, we're ashamed, we need to hide ourselves from God, like maybe he'll treat us better if we hide our nakedness?
well, the
Or it's
backdrop,
like the fact that they thought they could hide, the fact that they thought their conversation was exclusive of God's knowledge in some sense.
well,
Or like the conclusion that they came to, that, oh, God was lying to us the whole time, and he actually doesn't want us to be as powerful as he is.
Well, this is
How did
where
they- and
things
how did they
get-
get that?
well, here's the thing.
No.
The backdrop was different, obviously, like Adam and Eve in paradise. But we can understand Adam and Eve's sin quite well, actually, because we do the same thing.
Okay.
Why we have way more theological information
Right.
than Adam and Eve did,
Right.
like facts. We have the completed canon of Scripture. We have
Yes.
So sure, Adam and Eve experientially had an experience with God that you and I have never had.
Not yet.
The disciples walked with Christ bodily, yet they were capable of sin. We're capable of sin. In one sense, we actually, it could be argued that we should be less capable of sin than Adam and Eve or the disciples were, because we have the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so I want to ask this now, because it does seem like it's important. You're making a point that we understand, but earlier I was saying we do have a fallen sin nature. One of the unique facts about the fall of Adam and Eve is that they were sinning without a sin nature. And does that matter at all or no?
I think it does matter, and this might be worth a discussion in of itself, because my understanding of sin and how it works has changed over the years. So there are two types of sin. Like sin proper is, a very simple definition would be that it's anything contrary to the telos of creation, the design of God. And so we often think of sin in purely legal terms. Like in Adam and Eve sinned in a legal way. They were told not to do something, they did something, they're guilty of that sin, therefore.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that sin, like the sin nature, isn't something that we are guilty of per se. And this is why it's important. We'll get very practical here. And there's questions of the nature of baptism and how that works in regards to sin. Does it wash away original sin? That may be something fun to talk about too. But I would say the reason why it matters is because creation, which like trees can't sin, animals can't sin, volcanoes erupting, like, they're not committing a sin in the sense of they're doing something legally wrong. And I'm using legally. Nonetheless, we read in like Romans 8 where it talks about creation waits with eager longing. So like the creation itself in poetic language is sinful, for lack of a better term. But
Bad.
what's interesting,
What you just mean bad?
yeah, but what's interesting is when Adam and Eve sinned, they didn't just they just didn't do something wrong, but they introduced a sort of, and this is part of this. I said I don't like the appeal to mystery, but I honestly don't know how this works. And I think Thomas Aquinas actually made the comment that he thought sin was transmitted through like the sperm of, which, there's a whole rabbit trail to go down.
I guess believe that in the sense of begottenness.
But the reason why it matters, I think, is because we have to understand that sin isn't just something that we do. Sin is something that we are. The East, like the Eastern Church, and I use Eastern Church in regard, like just kind of as a dichotomy of the Western Church. The East seems to look at sin as a sickness, right?
Something we do, something we are. But I mean, that really sounds like sin nature is the
but Adam and Eve, but we have to, sure.
So we could say Adam and Eve were not sin.
Well, the reason why it matters is because Adam and Eve weren't conceived in sin.
Yes.
They weren't born in sin.
Yes.
There was no sin nature, yet they still sinned.
Born.
Right? So, yeah, I mean, and we're starting to get into things where we have to speculate how it practically works. But the point remains that when I sin today, I did something wrong. Like I did.
Okay.
Now and this is a question that honestly I might wrestle with for my entire life because it's just a very difficult thing for me to solve. Okay, so whether I'm quote unquote sick with sin, that doesn't change the fact that I'm guilty of my sin.
Yeah.
However, I think what's so interesting is that, and this is sort of the beauty I think of the gospel, is that it doesn't just free me from the, like I think evangelicalism focuses heavily on the penal substitutionary model of the atonement, which is true.
Yeah.
I don't deny that at all.
Okay.
But there's so much other things that Christ's work on the cross and the resurrection did for us, in that it not just freed us from the guilt of our sin, but it also freed us from the stain of sin. Like we are sick and we are in need of healing so that we don't sin. And that I think matters deeply from a practical level of how do we fight against sin. Like for example, if you're someone who, like on one hand, and this is the whole concept of like what the law of Moses was, it was a lot of don't do this, don't do this, don't do this.
Right.
But it never actually healed the nature of sin that exists within all of human nature. So
Yes.
I don't know if that answers your question or not, and I know that literally opens many cans of worms.
1,000 more questions.
Yes.
And we will be answering those. And
Well, no, we won't. We won't
Not-
be
not
answering
right now.
those. Well, broadly, I think
we will be discussing them.
yes,
Let me say
discussing.
it
Yeah,
accurately.
let's not.
We'll be discussing them,
Yes.
not answering them.
Yes.
So many things to discuss, and we'll keep discussing them. But we do unfortunately have to wrap this up now. So hopefully in the future, these episodes will be a lot longer. But many great things to ponder and think about until we come back. So
Agreed.
that's all for now.